Depending on where you are, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. We'd like to thank you for attending today's NSSG Talks webinar on maritime insecurity in the Black Sea and the implications on Europe. First, I'd like to say that we are recording this webinar, and the recording and presentation will be made available to all attendees, and we'll probably send that out by the end of the week or early next week. Hello, my name is Joe Frederick, Senior Consultant with NSSG. With me today are Valentin Munteanu, Senior Intelligence Analyst with a specialism in Eastern and Central Europe, and Stephanos Chaillou, Senior Intelligence Analyst with a specialism on Southern and Western Europe. Today, we will be presenting on a region that has had profound impact on global economies since the onset of the Ukraine war. And in the European context, the war's impacts have been more direct and severe, forcing governments and businesses to reformulate their respective strategies and activities. We felt that this topic was relevant for today's briefing, particularly as Europe is about to divorce itself from the dependencies of Russian energy and as Moscow readjusts its strategies in Ukraine, as well as rethink its geopolitical positions globally. This topic will be presented in 3 parts. Part 1 will focus on the significant developments in the Black Sea region from a security perspective and in the context of the Ukraine war, followed by developments and impacts on Eastern Europe. The second part will cover Turkey, Southeastern, Southern, and Western Europe. For the third part, both analysts will offer their insights and outlooks on the region. We will conclude the webinar with a Q&A session. Without further delay, I'll hand the mic over to Valentin. Valentin?
Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. I would start my first part of the presentation with a short description of the geopolitical profile of the Black Sea. First thing that must be said about this region is that it is one of the most important transit areas in Europe. It connects Europe to Asia and the ex-Soviet space to Central Europe through the Danube and the MENA region through the Mediterranean Sea. As all the transit areas in the world, Black Sea is no exception. Therefore, it is highly diversified and heterogeneous. It consists of 6 riparian states: Russia, Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia. And all the states present the same insecurity clusters. The first one, we can mention the political problems. All the 6 states experienced in the recent past dictatorships as political forms, with 5 of them experienced the communist regime, which of the 5 countries. From an economical and social perspective, the transition from communism to democracy was accompanied by endemic corruption and social inequalities. For example, out of the states in the Black Sea region, only Georgia scores higher than 50 in Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index. Not least, we have the security problems. All the states deal with the high levels of human and drug trafficking. And also we have here the security problems generated by issues with ethnic minorities. The most visible one being the problem with Russian-speaking minorities. You can see on the map that there is an obvious pattern here. Russia invaded all the states in the region in one form or another. All the states that have a strong Russian-speaking minority. It started with the the Russian-speaking minority in Moldova, in Transnistria, more exactly. Then followed Georgia in 2008 with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and then Ukraine in 2014, and more recently this year in February. To cope with these problems, local states developed security initiatives, which can be divided into two categories. First one is the category which included all the 6 riparian states. We have here as the best example Turkey's initiative called Black Sea 4, which saw between the early 2000s and 2014 joint naval exercises between the fleets of all the 6 riparian states. This initiative ended in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea, and although it was not officially ended, Black Sea 4 suspended its activity. A second category of local initiatives would be the ones that excluded Russia, that perceived Russia from the start as a threat to the local security. And we have here, as example, the Black Sea Maritime Forum, which was launched by Romania in February 2022, days before the invasion of Russia in Ukraine. This initiative aimed to gather together the 5 remaining riparian states, excluding Russia, therefore, and representatives from foreign states with interests in the Black Sea region, like the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. Speaking of involvement of foreign actors in this region, we should also mention that since 2004, NATO shares a border with the Black Sea after Romania and Bulgaria joined the organization, and also the same two states joined the European Union in 2007, which brings us into a situation when both NATO and the European Union share a border with the Black Sea, which is larger than 2,000 kilometers. Although both organizations, both NATO and the EU, tried their best to present their expansion in the Black Sea as an intention to boost collaboration with Russia and not as a move against Russian interests in the region. There were 2 actions by these organizations that upset Russia. The first one being a declaration of US President George W. Bush in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit, when he mentioned that Georgia and Ukraine might join NATO one day. And the second initiative from the EU this time being the launch of the Eastern Partnership, which was, although it was described by the European Union just as a measure to boost cooperation with the states in the region, it was perceived by Russia as an initiative by the European Union to counter its influence in the Black Sea region. Joe, if you can help me with the next slide. Thank you. The Eastern Partnership brought the Vilnius Summit in 2013. Here, Georgia and Moldova signed all the agreements with the European Union, while other countries such as Armenia and Azerbaijan limited to themselves to just sign the agreements concerning visa facilitation with the European Union. Ukraine at that time, which was led by a pro-Russian president, Viktor Yanukovych, refused to join the EU's Eastern Partnership, and Yanukovych publicly declared that he is seeking to align Ukraine to the local initiatives of Russia, especially the Euro-Asian Economic Union. This announcement triggered massive unrest in Ukraine, with population revolting on the streets, and this gave birth to the Maidan Revolution, or the Revolution of Dignity. This revolution succeeded in overthrowing the administration of President Yanukovych, and it replaced this administration with an interim pro-Euro-Atlantic government. Following this, Russia annexed the Crimean Peninsula, where it had already stationed its Black Sea fleet in the port cities of Simferopol and Sevastopol. Following this annexation, Russia did not stop here, and it encouraged the start of a pro-Russia separatist rebellion in the eastern oblasts of Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. European states, France and Germany, intervened diplomatically and summoned both Ukraine and Russia to negotiations, which took the name of the Normandy format. These negotiations within this format brought the signing of the Minsk Protocol, first in 2014 and then in 2015. These two Minsk agreements succeeded in containing the conflict in eastern Ukraine. However, they failed to bring a definite end to the military fighting between the government in Kiev and the separatist rebels in eastern Ukraine. What happened next was a series of initiatives from both Ukraine and Russia that were perceived as hostile by both sides. For example, Gazprom halted gas supplies to Ukraine in 2015, or Russia cancelled free trade agreement with Ukraine 1 year later in 2016. On the other side, the Ukrainian parliament voted to join NATO in 2017. Then President Zelensky, a pro-Euro-Atlantic political figure, was elected, and this president declared that NATO membership should be a national goal for Ukraine. Following these developments, Russia started to mass its troops near the border with Ukraine, and in February 2022, this led to an invasion from Russia into Ukraine in 3 directions. First one in the north, with the aim to reach capital Kiev, and the other 2 directions of attack in east and southern Ukraine. What is important about the attack direction in the south is that in the first days of the invasion, Russia seized Snake Island, which, Joe, if you can help me with the next slide. Thank you. Snake Island is just a small rock in the Black Sea. However, it is the last land obstacle between Crimea, which since 2014 has been annexed by Russia, and NATO border of Romania, and the Danube Delta, which, as I said at the beginning, controls the transit from the Black Sea towards Central Europe. However, in this summer, after Moskva, the admiral ship of the Russian Black Sea Navy, was destroyed by Ukrainian forces, Russia abandoned voluntarily this Snake Island. This would be the main military developments of the conflict. On an economic perspective, we can start with the elephant in the room, which is the energy market. As you already know, for decades, Europe has enjoyed a special economic model based on cheap Russian oil imports. However, more recently, the EU adopted sanctions about Russian entities, and starting with December, it will ban Russian crude oil imports, and with February next year, it will ban all Russian oil imports. There is, though, an important caveat to make here. These restrictions only refer to seaborne oil, like the one transited in the Black Sea. The oil transited through pipelines is not forbidden by these two bans in December and February. As I mentioned, transit in the Black Sea, we can now switch to maritime routes. In the first days of the invasion, all maritime traffic across the coasts of Ukraine was stopped, and Ukraine had to deliver most of its products. As you know, Ukraine is a major exporter of agricultural products by railway and by road. However, only a part of its agricultural products could be exported by rail and by road, with a certain part being abandoned. What else Ukraine did was to revive the transit through the Bistro Channel, which you can see is the small red line on the map. This is a channel which links the Danube with the Black Sea. However, it is highly controversial because it has a negative impact on the environment. And this usage of the channel by Ukrainian forces was only allowed by the Romanian government in June this year. Starting with July, with the mediation of both the United Nations and Turkey, Ukraine and Russia reached an agreement named the Black Sea Grain Deal, which allows Ukrainian ships transit a safe corridor in the Black Sea and reach Istanbul and then their end markets. What is also important to say about this grain deal is that it managed to help Ukraine reach pretty much the same levels of grain exports as it had before the war started. The last important thing to be mentioned about this grain deal is that since November, Russia will be allowed to export its much needed fertilizers into developing countries in Africa and Asia that really depend on this fertilizer. In fact, yesterday Russia shipped its first transport with fertilizers under this agreement. The last thing of my first part of the presentation would be about asset security and insurance. Following the war, over 1,000 companies announced that they are leaving Russia. Therefore, they left behind property and assets and suffered losses in revenue. Insurance company S&P Global predicts that these losses could reach $35 billion. As for Ukraine, military strikes and and street fighting have caused significant damage to Ukrainian property. And it is important to say that companies with insurance are not automatically compensated for their loss provoked by military strikes. Also, insurance coverage for land transit of cargo in Ukraine is no longer available. As for maritime insurance, following the outbreak of the conflict, international cargo organizations listed the Black Sea as an area of increased risk. Therefore, ships sailing in Ukrainian and Russian territorial waters have to pay additional premiums. In March, this area of increased risk was extended to the waters of the Romanian and Georgian coasts. Also, since the conflict broke out, Western major players in the insurance industry, such as Lloyd's and Swiss Re, have stopped taking new maritime business from Russia. And they were replaced by the Russian state-owned insurance company RNRC, which is now providing insurance to fleets shipping under the Russian flag. Also, one thing important to mention here is that EU will prohibit EU companies to insure any Russian oil shipment starting with December 5th this year. In terms of aircraft insurance, United Kingdom, European Union, and the US prohibited the supply of aircraft or parts of aircraft to Russia, as well as related insurance. This was followed by Russia's decision to nationalize all foreign leased aircraft. And according to rating agencies, losses that companies with exposure to Russian nationalization of foreign leased aircraft may suffer a loss between $6 and $15 billion. This would conclude my first part, and I would like to give the floor to my colleague Stephanos.
Thank you very much, Valentin, for those excellent insights. If we move on to the first slide, please, Joe. It's difficult to overstate Turkey's role in the prolongation of the UN grain deal. Despite Russia withdrawing from the agreement in October, it reversed course 2 days later, highlighting Turkey's growing influence in the region. The deal is important because it allows the export of key agricultural products, including wheat and corn, from 3 Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. Prior to the war, Black Sea ports in Ukraine accounted for 90% of grain and oilseeds exports, 30% of which were destined for Europe, China, and Africa. However, a naval blockade, Russian attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure, and the presence of sea mines has deteriorated the overall security context in the Black Sea. The NATO Shipping Center has said that the threat of drifting mines was still present in southern parts of the Black Sea. NATO also classifies the threat to civilian shipping in the west of the Crimean Peninsula as high. Beyond the Black Sea, rising tensions in the Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey reflect an increasingly tense geopolitical setting in the Eastern Mediterranean. An agreement on the 3rd of October between Turkey and Libya's Tripoli-based government for offshore oil and gas exploration triggered a new episode in already tense relations between Athens and Ankara. While tensions between the two countries are not particularly new, in recent weeks, there has been a marked intensification in nationalistic rhetoric on both sides. Moreover, according to the Greek Defense Ministry, between January and October 2022, Turkish military aircraft carried out over 8,000 violations of Greek airspace, compared with just under 3,000 in 2021. In the context of the war in Ukraine and rising tensions with Turkey, earlier this month, Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis said that the government would cancel the tender for the sale of a majority stake in the port of Alexandroupolis. The creation of the first floating natural gas regasification storage unit and its role as a major entry point for US weapons destined for Ukraine have elevated its strategic importance. Moreover, a planned upgrade of the port to handle more capacity forms part of a broader strategy to offer a viable alternative to seaborne traffic through the Turkish Straits. It should be said that the chances of a Greece-Turkey conflict are low. However, an elevated deployment of military assets in the region heightens the risk of accidents. We should expect tensions to continue as Greece, Turkey, and Cyprus are set to hold elections in 2023. In this context, domestic political considerations will be the key foreign policy driver in the coming months. In terms of recent developments in Southern Europe in the context of the war, I think the case of Italy is a particularly interesting one. Firstly, in Italy, the new right-wing government has been supportive of Ukraine and pledged more assistance despite concerns that Rome could be reluctant to show the same level of support in a coalition consisting of party members that previously maintained close ties with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Like many European countries, the Italian economy has been adversely impacted by the war, with some firms in the auto industry being forced to cut production due to a sudden interruption of components from Ukraine. Before the war, Italy was dependent on Russia for gas, which accounted for 43% of its imports. However, in April, a deal between Algeria's Sonatrach and Italy's Eni committed Algeria to sending Italy an additional 9 billion cubic meters of gas by next year and in 2024. Norway and Azerbaijan have also increased gas supplies to Italy, where the country's 3 regasification units are operating at full capacity. Moving on to Northern Europe, Germany has sought to take a series of proactive steps to offset a shortfall in natural gas and oil imports from Russia. In 2021, Russia exported 55% of Germany's gas imports, a figure that dropped to 26% by the end of June due to reduced flows via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline. Berlin has sought to develop capacity in a bid to start the rapid import of LNG, held talks with countries like Qatar and Canada to increase LNG imports, and passed a law that would reactivate oil and coal-fired plants in the event of a significant disruption in gas supply. From a security perspective, it is also worth mentioning the leaks from the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 pipelines in September, with evidence suggesting that the blasts were intentionally caused in a possible sabotage attack. It is reasonable to anticipate further such threats against European energy infrastructure. Indeed, authorities in Norway have expanded security patrols around offshore energy facilities amid reports of suspicious drone sightings. If we move on to the next slide, please, Joe, we can examine the economic sector implications of the war in a bit more detail. A clear sign relating to the economic impact of the war on Europe is, of course, rising inflation, and more or less the consensus among economists that a global slowdown is likely next year. Inflation will contribute to a rising cost of living and impact companies' supply lines. The war in Ukraine has left many organizations facing rising costs, operational disruption, and a rapid deterioration of the security environment. In a way, it compounded already strained supply chains during the pandemic, while the transfer of goods to and from Ukraine has been complicated due to a lack of appropriate infrastructure at land borders. Efforts to lower processing times have been made in line with the Poland-Ukraine so-called open borders initiative. However, the risk of congestion at crossings will remain elevated in the short term. This has reignited discussions that emerged during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic over the need to shorten international supply chains to improve resilience. There is also a risk of energy disruption as demand rises in the winter months. In some extreme scenario cases, blackouts and restrictions may be imposed, but such instances will likely be very isolated. A lot, of course, will depend on environmental factors, such as an unusually cold winter. While many countries have field reserves and will thus have an added layer of protection against such emergency measures, more challenges should be expected next year in the event of a permanent halt in Russian energy exports. Among the most impacted industries are the agricultural and chemical sectors. Russia and Ukraine were major exporters of agricultural goods, minerals, fertilizers, and energy. Once an embargo on Russian oil imports is implemented in February 2023, EU countries will need to find non-Russian alternatives of diesel. In countries like France, with a large agricultural sector, prices have impacted production and operational costs. With Russia and Ukraine accounting for a large share in wheat and maize exports used for animal feed, rising prices have adversely impacted producers. I'll now pass it back to Valentin for part 3 of the presentation.
Thank you very much. My last part of the presentation will focus on forecasts and outlook for Eastern Europe for next year. As you can see from the two graphics on the slide, GDP growth expected for Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey is quite low, while inflation expected for the same three countries is quite high. This is due to a high level of uncertainty about commodity prices and energy security. Despite this, what must be said is that experts who provided these forecasts did not fully take into consideration all factors, and they were honest about this. What could change the trend is the successful implementation of initiatives related to EU post-pandemic recovery funds, which are in the space of billions for Romania and Bulgaria. And also both countries find themselves in a situation which is not tragic when it comes to dependency on Russian oil and gas. For example, Romania has historically had a small level of reliance on Russian fossil fuels. It only imported 30% of its oil and gas from Russia before the war, with the remaining 70% being assured through local production. Bulgaria, while dependent before the war on Russian fossil fuels, it managed to open a new pipeline with Greece, which brings gas from Azerbaijan, and Bulgaria also succeeded in signing some agreements to bring liquefied natural gas from the United States and the MENA states such as Qatar and Algeria. Romania is also pursuing such opportunities with similar agreements expected to be signed in the following months. And in addition, Romania also started to produce oil from its first offshore natural gas called Media, and it expects to start production from a second oil field called Neptune Deep. Turkey, on the third hand, wants to succeed in achieving independence from from Russian fossil fuels imports by starting to extract itself oil from an offshore field in the Black Sea. And also on energy side, it is looking to build a new nuclear power plant. Romania and Bulgaria on this side already have nuclear and hydropower plants, with both states looking to expand production by adding additional reactors to their already existing nuclear and hydropower plants. Therefore, one must conclude that all three states, Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, find themselves in an encouraging position to achieve independency from Russian fossil fuels and start the transition to non-Russian sources of energy. This would be my last part. I would give the floor again to you, Stephanos.
Thank you, Valentin. In terms of the outlook for 2023, figures from organizations such as the OECD indicate a slowdown in year-on-year GDP growth, with some countries like Germany and the UK being disproportionately affected as we can see on this graph on the right-hand side. For Germany, industrial activity will be hampered by energy supply disruption, while in the UK, rising interest rates and lower investor confidence will adversely impact economic conditions. Seen in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic ramifications of the war in Ukraine are likely to accelerate the regionalization of supply chains, whereby production is brought closer to consumers. More economic protectionism as well as political intervention in private markets is a likely policy response in the coming months, as national governments seek to shield consumers and important sectors. Meanwhile, worsening economic conditions and rising insecurity will fuel the potential for widespread social unrest. Strikes and protests will probably increase in frequency in major European economies. The geopolitical context in Europe will remain volatile, and organizations will need to continually adapt to a constantly evolving landscape. While early unity and EU solidarity were key features in the early phases of the war, this will be challenging to maintain because political leaders will face growing internal pressures at home as the war in Ukraine shows no clear end in sight. Joe, back to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Stephanos and Valentin, on your insights and respective outlooks on the region. At this moment, I'd like to open up the sessions to questions and answer. Perhaps, Lily, you can help on this.
Sure. I have a question. So first of all, thank you for the wonderful presentation. Yeah, it's very interesting to see this perspective upon the Black Sea. And I say this with a reason, because I just ended 2 days of attendance at the Aspen German Marshall Fund forum here in Bucharest, which was opened by Jan Stoltenberg, who was attending here in Bucharest the NATO meeting. So the message was very, very clear. NATO is looking at the Black Sea in a completely new perspective. And I was wondering if Valentin and Stephanos, would you like to comment a bit about these new changes into the NATO perspective and how this is an opportunity for the Black Sea states? Thank you.
Thank you, Lily, for your question. With your permission, I would like to address the question. What I can say is that NATO does not want to be involved in the military conflict from a military perspective. NATO states do help Ukraine with money and military equipment. However, leaders from the United States, such as President Joe Biden, clearly expressed their will that they do not want to be involved militarily in the conflict. What NATO is looking, though, is to make sure that it creates a capability within the organization which is itself strong enough to deter any possible future Russian aggression against NATO member states. And in this sense, NATO military powers such as the US, France, Spain, and the UK sent on the Black Sea and also in states neighboring the Baltic Sea military forces to create a force capable of deterrence to deter any possible Russian aggression in the region in the context of the ongoing war in Ukraine. So what I would say is that NATO is strongly committed to assuring the independence of member states and their security against a possible Russian threat in the region. That would be all from me. Stephanos, if you want to add something?
Thanks, Valentin. I think that's a really interesting question. Not really much to add. I think that was very comprehensive. I think that really the dilemma for NATO states, especially NATO states, sort of in the region, is how do they enhance security without sort of risking a possible direct confrontation with Russia? And I think that would really be what we're going to be looking out for, right? How can they, in a way, enhance security, or at least sort of broaden their security in the Black Sea without risking that element of provocation or confrontation? I think that would be something to look out for. What we are seeing certainly is a much more robust security posture across the eastern flank, and we're seeing, as Valentin said, a lot of support for Ukraine. I think there was also Secretary Blinken, who just today said that there will be much more assistance as well for Ukraine, particularly focusing on anti-air defenses. So I think what we're likely going to see is that there will be an element of continuity in that support for Ukraine, of course, and then as well solutions vis-a-vis how those states can actually improve the security situation in the Black Sea in a way that they can control without risking that escalation.
Thanks for those responses. I'd like to kind of follow on from that because there's the NATO Foreign Ministers Summit yesterday and today, and there's been some statements from foreign ministers about the support that they'll provide to NATO. But as well as kind of NATO's review of Ukraine's membership. So I guess it's two parts. So what is the likelihood of Ukraine, gaining membership to NATO, and when it gets membership, you obviously join these kind of blocks for like the collective security agreement, basically. But what you're kind of saying is that NATO doesn't want to get into any direct confrontation with Russia at this stage. But does that render the collective security guarantees kind of moot in this sense? If it allows Ukraine to join, but yet again, NATO won't come to its aid from a kind of direct military response.
Yeah, I can sort of initiate that discussion, Valentin, and maybe you can add some of your insights. I think that's a really good point, Joe, and I think that's also why the Ukrainian membership bid for NATO is in my view very unlikely, because I don't think they would be ready to accept Ukraine as a member, especially because they would then be be inclined to sort of intervene in the conflict. So as long as there's also an active conflict in Ukraine, I think the chances are very low that they would accept such a situation. Ultimately, I think any such scenario would become slightly more likely if there is a peaceful resolution to the conflict, which again seems very distant at this stage. And again, that would the NATO element would be a key feature of any peace agreement with Russia, because Russia would never really accept Ukraine joining NATO. Again, that's a very contentious point. And of course, President Zelensky has been very favorable to joining NATO. But again, within NATO, there's not a lot of consensus, I should say, on this Ukrainian membership bid. I know that France is very skeptical. So I think that, as long as we're seeing this element of division within NATO states over a possible Ukrainian membership, I think, and of course the ongoing war, those are two very important elements, and two elements that at the moment are very big obstacles for an eventual membership, eventual participation in the alliance.
Okay, Valentin, would you care to add to that?
Sure, I can only add one thing. NATO decision to incorporate Ukraine is highly unlikely in the near future. As Stephanos said, this would not be accepted by Russia as a negotiation point for the start of the end of the conflict. And also there is another element that should be taken into consideration. If Ukraine joins NATO and NATO deploys long range missiles in Ukraine, they would also be capable of reaching Chinese territory. So that would start another discussion about the Chinese perspective on NATO. Therefore, given that Ukraine joining NATO would bring a high level of insecurity in both Russia and Ukraine, I believe that nobody is considering this possibility of Ukraine joining NATO as something to be proceeded with in the upcoming future.
Thank you so much, Valentin. Thank you for your answers. Thank you, Stefan and Valentin, for the presentation, for the wonderful presentation, and for the answers and the perspective that you gave upon the Black Sea and what's its new strategic role for the entire region, for NATO, for the EU, and of course for the world. How it turned to be such an important location for how the events evolved in the recent years. We have Joe back with us, but I was ready to close for him because he had a technical issue. But back to you, Joe, with the mic.
Yeah, apologies for that. So let me just into the internet. Yeah. Let me just share my screen again. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah, I do apologize for that. I don't know what happened. I got kicked out of the webinar. So, and I don't know where Lily got up to. I just have one more question for both Valentin and Stephanos regarding some of these peripheral states' involvement in the Ukraine conflict. I mean, Belarus not so, not kind of littoral to the Black Sea, but Turkey's involvement as well. Turkey especially seems to have as kind of gained this status of being kind of an interlocutor between like the West and Russia, if you will, as it is with the West and the Middle East, basically. Which kind of puts it in a very good position to a leverage position, I would say. And then there's Belarus with the recent reports of kind of suggesting that Belarus might get more directly involved in the conflict. So my question is kind of two parts, right? So what is the likelihood of kind of Belarus getting involved in the conflict with, there's kind of implications of kind of political leadership change in the sense that Moscow would like someone that's more pro-Moscow and to kind of, favor its position in the Ukraine conflict, and Turkey as well. I mean, Turkey is also trying to join the EU. I don't know if it's kind of abandoned that, but, what is the likelihood of, what would be the triggers for Turkey to get more involved in kind of negotiations as well? So I'll just leave it at that. So there's Belarus and there's Turkey.
Yeah, sure. So let's take them one by one. First, Belarus. We already know that the local population does not support an invasion into Ukraine. We also have volunteers from Belarus fighting alongside Ukrainian army against Russian forces. Therefore, any decision for Belarus to join the war would bring a high level of massive unrest in the country. In terms of political change, there was an incident these days when the Minister of Foreign Affairs was found dead, apparently with no natural signs showing that he had, prior to his death, suffered from any condition. This led to speculation in foreign media that he might have been the victim of a Russian attack, and given that he was perceived as a liberal political figure, this led Western analysts to speculate that he might have fallen victim to Vladimir Putin's regime. What we know for sure for now is that President Lukashenko increased security measures around him, and no signs to date show that Lukashenko has changed his thinking about not joining the war in Ukraine alongside Russian forces. In respect to the second question about Turkey, we also know that it's preoccupied now with the aftermath of the terrorist attack in Istanbul, and it thinks about the possibility of starting an invasion in Kurdish controlled areas in neighboring Syria. Therefore, I see Turkey more involved in this period in collaborating with the United States and Russia on receiving the go-ahead for a military operation in Kurdish-controlled areas in Syria, rather than Turkey focusing its diplomatic efforts on the Ukrainian conflict. This would be my analysis of the two questions.
Yeah, I think I broadly agree with what Valentin's just said. I think on the question of Belarus being involved in the conflict or becoming more directly involved, I think there are very strong disincentives. So one, of course, is the one Valentin mentioned. The war is very unpopular in Belarus. So we would likely to see large-scale unrest spread across the country if there were any indications of a direct involvement. But again, I think there would be a few warning signs to monitor. One would be whether or not there is a sort of media speculation or a concerted media effort to perhaps try and influence the public opinion towards the war. So if we're seeing indications of that, or if we're seeing a possible sort of false flag operation or anything that might give Belarus a pretext to get more directly involved, even on a gradual basis, I think those would be definitely triggers to monitor. In terms of the role of Turkey, I think that's very, very right to say, Joe, that Turkey has very capably sort of leveraged the situation to its benefit, right? I mean, of course, from the conflict, it has a lot to lose, or indeed, it did lose, because, of course, maritime trade in the Black Sea has now declined in volume. The Straits of Bosphorus and the Dardanelles are key transit points, so very important for Turkey to be able to keep those open. And of course, the higher the traffic, the more advantage and the more benefit there is to Turkey, of course. So a deteriorating security environment in the Black Sea is certainly not to Turkey's benefit. Of course, it has been able to leverage that position and leverage ties it has with both Ukraine and Russia to play this role of this sort of dominant power broker in the region, as we've mentioned during the presentation. And in parallel to that, we've seen it sort of, as Valentin said, intensifying airstrikes in northern Syria, but also being a bit more assertive and taking a bit of more I'd say, a bit of a nationalist term vis-a-vis the statements made relating to Greek islands, which are close to the Turkish mainland in recent weeks. So we're seeing a lot of there's a lot of parallel elements to what Turkey is doing. One complements the other, but I think that overall it has been able to leverage their situation and the context to its favor, and I think that we'll continue to see those kinds of movements taking place in the next few months, particularly ahead of the election next year.
Okay, great, guys. Thank you very much for those insightful answers to those questions. I know it's a very difficult situation to kind of constantly monitor and kind of predict the next movements of adversarial kind of actors there. But I think we found your insights very, very useful and relevant. Well, that concludes our webinar. We hope you found the presentation useful. And should you have any further questions or comments, then please do not hesitate to reach us at our service desk, which the email is servicedesk@nssg.global. Thank you and have a great day.